Hey everybody, this is the top 10 facts you didn't know about the Beatles album With the Beatles. This was released in 1963, happens to be the Beatles' second album released in the UK. And of course, it had a mono version and a stereo version. And I personally prefer the mono version, but the stereo version has some good things about it as well that we will be talking about a little bit later. But let's jump right into the 10 facts. So here we go with number one, and yes, I have notes. So, fact number one has to do with the cover. This is a very, very famous cover, as I'm sure all of you know. It has been copied many, many times, and it's just pretty much the symbol of Beatlemania. This is how a lot of the world first saw the Beatles when they were just absolutely taking over everything. So this is a very, very famous shot, and the cover was taken by the photographer Robert Freeman. And Robert Freeman, it's kind of a cool story how the Beatles and Robert Freeman kind of hooked up. So Brian Epstein was looking at a bunch of photographs of John Coltrane, the famous jazz musician, and that Robert Freeman had taken pictures of. So Robert Freeman had taken pictures of John Coltrane. Brian Epstein loved the photos, and he contacted Robert Freeman to take pictures of Brian Epstein's group, the Beatles. So Robert Freeman showed up to the Beatles' hotel room, and they set up this shot, and the Beatles wanted him to try to duplicate some photos that their friend Astrid had taken of them in Hamburg, which were like these kind of moody, half-lit kind of shots. So in order to duplicate that, Robert Freeman took them into a corridor in the hotel and set up the shot and had them all, he posed them all like this. And it just became this very, very, very famous shot of the Beatles. And in fact, George Harrison, a famous quote that he said in the anthology was, this is the beginning of us being actively involved in the Beatles' artwork. The first one where we thought, hey, let's get artistic. Because famously, George had said that he thought the previous album, Please Please Me album cover, was crap. And it's a very George thing to say. By the way, happy birthday, George Harrison. This is would have been George Harrison's birthday. And we all love George, so kind of nice to have a little George quote in there for our very first fact. Okay, fact number two. Now this is kind of a weird one that I didn't know about, but I did some research and found this one out. So in the UK in 1963, albums and singles were included on the same singles chart. LPs could be included in singles charts. And oddly enough, With the Beatles was a top 20 single hit because it was considered a record, a single, even though it had multiple songs on it. And it got high up in the charts. It made it to number 11, which is pretty insane to think about. So With the Beatles made it to number 11 in the UK charts. Very, very weird. By the way, after 1963, they changed the rule so that LPs could not be included in the singles chart. So this is a very weird and rare occurrence, but it happened. Number three, there were probably a lot of other songs, but there are definitely two songs that the Beatles had available at the time they were recording with the Beatles. And they were two songs that were written specifically for another artist that was also managed by Brian Epstein, an artist named Billy J. Kramer, who was hooked up with a group called the Dakotas. And the two songs are both Lennon-McCartney originals. They are really, really good songs, in my opinion. The first song is the most famous of the two. It's a song called Bad to Me that was written by John Lennon, although some people say that it was written by John and Paul, but it's definitely was started out as a John song. And it was recorded by Billy J. Kramer. And the other song is a song called I'll Keep You Satisfied, which is a bit of a lesser known song, and I think it's more of a Paul song than a John song. But it was also recorded by Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. Now, both of these songs were recorded at the same time the Beatles were recording with the Beatles at Abbey Road. And these two songs were also recorded at Abbey Road with George Martin producing them. And in fact, for the Bad to Me session, Paul McCartney was in attendance. And for the I'll Keep You Satisfied session, John Lennon was in attendance. So these two songs, Bad to Me and I'll Keep You Satisfied, were both really songs of the time, of this time period that at least John and Paul were both thinking about quite a lot. So it's kind of interesting to think that if those songs could have made it to the album. Now, obviously, they didn't make it to the album, and they were written specially for Billy J. Kramer. But, I'm sure it would have been interesting to note that if John or Paul had really fallen in love with the song they had written, then it could have ended up on With the Beatles. So, interesting to kind of note that those two songs were floating around at the time. Another song this is, by the way, fact number 4. Another song that was floating around at the time that the Beatles gave away to another artist is a song called I Want to Be Your Man. Now, I Want to Be Your Man, of course, is sung by Ringo on With the Beatles. But before Ringo sang it on With the Beatles, John and Paul gave the song to the Rolling Stones. So the famous story is that John and Paul were walking around London, and Mick and Keith were in a taxi, and they saw John and Paul walking. They honked the horn. John and Paul hopped into the cab. And I guess they headed to either a recording studio or a rehearsal space or something with Mick and Keith. They showed up there, and Mick and Keith said, "Do you guys have any songs that we could record? Because we have to record a new single." And John and Paul played them an early version of I Want to Be Your Man that wasn't complete. And Mick and Keith obviously both liked the song. And so they said, yeah, we'd like to do it. So John and Paul then went into the corner of the room and finished the song up. They wrote they finished up the words or something, and finished it up right in front of Mick and Keith and gave them the song. And this is what inspired Mick and Keith to then start writing songs on their own, because they saw John and Paul do it. They saw how magical it was and how it seemed pretty easy for them. And so that inspired them to write their own songs. So I Want to Be Your Man was originally given to the Rolling Stones, and then the Beatles went on to record it with Ringo on With the Beatles. Fact number 5, the song Devil in Her Heart. Devil in Her Heart is a cover, and it's a song that was originally done by a group from Detroit called the Donnays, and it's a girl group. And the interesting thing about this song is that when George went over to the USA in 1963 to visit his sister, he picked up a lot of records, and one of those records happened to be this song, Devil in Her Heart, that they ended up recording on With the Beatles, that George, of course, sings the lead on. And by the way, I absolutely love Devil in Her Heart on this. I think it's one of the strong covers on this album. And really, really cool how George kind of just took this song that was in basically obscurity and put it on the map, because let's face it, without the song being on With the Beatles, probably not a lot of people would have heard it outside of Detroit. So I think that's very cool that George, on his trip to the USA to visit his sister, ended up finding this amazing song, and they covered it on their next album. Okay, fact number 6, the song Not a Second Time. Now, Not a Second Time is an amazing song that John sings lead on, and I think John wrote most of it, if not all of it. And this is the song that had the music critics and the music scholars, this is the song that really made them pay attention to the Beatles. And the reason is that they started talking about how the Beatles were using Aeolian cadences in this song. Now, John famously says, this is John's quote about the Aeolian cadences. He says, "To this day, I have no idea what they are. They sound like exotic birds," which is quite true. Now, describing what an Aeolian cadence is would be a little bit too in-depth for my videos, and honestly a little bit beyond me. But if you want to know where they are happening within the song, it's at the end of the line, "You hurt me then, you're back again, no, 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 not a second time." So it's that no, 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 that is considered an Aeolian cadence, because it's the way the chord progression goes throughout that line. That's the easiest, simplest way I can describe what an Aeolian cadence is within the song Not a Second Time. But the most important thing about that is that Not a Second Time is the song that got all the adults and all the serious people to pay attention to the Beatles as songwriters and as important just writers when it came to not just pop music for kids. It was now music that adults could really absorb and really like. So very important, Not a Second Time, and its Aeolian cadences. Okay, fact number 7. So there's a version of All My Lovin'. All My Lovin' is, of course, on this album, and it's one of the best songs on the album, written by Paul and sung by Paul. And there is a version, though, of All My Lovin' that is not on the mono or the stereo version of With the Beatles. And this version has, it's a stereo version, and it has 4 hits on the hi-hat that happen right before the song starts. And you can find this rare version of All My Lovin' on this German record called The Beatles' Greatest. Now, this is the only place you can find that original version of All My Lovin' with those 4 hi-hat hits. It's very cool. It's really, to the non-Beatle nerd, it's not a big deal. To the Beatle nerd, like myself, and probably you who are watching this video, it's a big deal. So if you ever can get your hands on this compilation album, this German compilation called Beatles' Greatest, it's worth it just for All My Lovin' alone, because it's very cool to hear those 4 taps of Ringo's hi-hat right before Paul starts singing All My Lovin'. So that's a cool little side note there. We'll put that back behind there. Okay, fact number 8. Now this is really cool in my opinion. So, as I was saying earlier, that I think that the mono version of With the Beatles is the way to listen to the album, because it just sounds really great, has great punch. The mono mix is just excellent. By the way, this happens to be the 2014 mono remaster that came out. These are almost impossible to find now. You can find them on eBay, but they're very, very expensive, but you can't really find them in the shops anymore. I love this pressing, by the way. I think it's excellent, and finding an original mono with the Beatles is very expensive and really, really hard to do, but this is a great pressing. But back to what I was talking about. So the mono mix is just excellent. The stereo mix, on the other hand, is not so good in my opinion. Now the stereo mix has the instruments way on one side and the vocals way on the other side for most of the songs. And the problem with that is it leaves a big kind of, although it's not really there, it feels like there's a big gap in the middle. So it doesn't feel like the stereo image is very well balanced. Because normally with a stereo record or mix, you have vocals in the middle, most of the time bass, and most of the time snare drum, stuff like that. There's something in the middle that's an important part of the song. And then you put other stuff on the sides, obviously, to create a good soundscape. The problem is that With the Beatles was recorded only on 2-track. Now, the 2-track record. By the way, this is just my general knowledge here. I believe this is true. The 2-track recording only had 2 tracks available. So a lot of times they would record the backing track onto one track, and then they would record vocals and whatever overdubs, maybe like hand claps or a guitar solo or a harmonica or something like that, onto the other track. So you'd end up with just 2 tracks of recorded stuff. So if you want to make a stereo mix of that, you have to either put one of the tracks over here or one of the tracks over here, or both of them kind of centered, which isn't really all that stereo. Now, for some reason, they decided to do like this hard panning of the instruments over here, vocals over here, which doesn't really, in my opinion, work all that well as far as the sound goes. But there is one major exception. The song Money, which is the last song on side 2. For Money, the stereo mix is actually really well balanced, and I have a theory as to why this is. So, Money was originally recorded without George Martin's piano. Just the Beatles recorded it. So they recorded it, what I think they did is they recorded it all onto one track. Vocals, everything, instruments, all on one track of the 2-track tape machine, with the intention of George Martin overdubbing his piano part later. So they did that. Then I take that back. They recorded it onto one 2-track machine, the backing track on one track, the vocals on another of the tracks. So those were the 2 tracks. Then they took a second 2-track machine and put the backing track of the song onto one of the new tracks, and then the vocals and everything also on there. But when George Martin overdubbed his piano part onto the second track, the vocal track from the existing machine bled over, so you get vocals on both of the new tracks. So you have This is getting confusing, I realize, but I'm trying to make it simple. So you have 2 tracks. On one of the tracks, you have the backing track with the vocals. On the other track, you have George Martin's piano overdub, also with the vocals on there. So you then are able to have a stereo mix where you have the instruments over here with the lead vocals, the piano overdub over here also with the lead vocals, which then creates so the lead vocals are in the center because they're both on both sides. So you have lead vocals here, backing track over here, piano over here. So you get a really excellent stereo mix of Money. So the stereo mix of With the Beatles is not the best, but it's worth owning just for Money alone because Money sounds excellent. So that was, I realized that was quite a lot of information I just threw at you and a lot of just kind of jumbled nonsense. But really, the story here is that Money stereo mix is Money. It's great. Okay, fact number 9. Here we go. So the Beatles famously hardly ever repeated themselves, right? They were so cutting edge. Every album was a brand new experience. It sounded so much different than the last one, and that is true for this album as well. But they did one thing that they repeated. They repeated a formula that they did on their first album, Please Please Me. They did the same thing with this album, and that formula is that they have 8 originals, so 8 songs by Lennon McCartney, actually 7 songs by Lennon McCartney, 1 song by George Harrison, but 8 originals, and then 6 cover songs. And they did the same thing on Please Please Me. So that was kind of a format that they repeated. I don't know if this was on purpose or that's just how it happened, but it is true with Please Please Me and with the Beatles. So kind of interesting note there. And the last fact number 10, the song Little Child. Now, Little Child is a song on here, it has a great harmonica part by John Lennon, but originally Little Child was written for Ringo. They were writing it in hopes that Ringo would sing it. But in the end, Ringo ended up not singing it, and he sang, of course, I Want to Be Your Man. But in Paul's book, by the way, which is a great book, it's called Many Years From Now, written by Barry Miles, who was a friend of Paul's during the 60s. But actually, the book is really Paul's autobiography, because there's so many just long pages of Paul talking, Paul quotes in there. But it's a great book called Many Years From Now. Highly recommend it. But in that book, he talks about Little Child and how it talks about how it was like basically a filler track, an album track, but it was originally written for Ringo. So kind of interesting to think about how that song would have sounded with Ringo singing it. I can definitely hear him singing it, but I love the way John and Paul sing it together. It's got a lot of energy and just a really, really great song on the album. So those were 10 facts that you maybe didn't know about with the Beatles. Now, of course, maybe you already knew all those facts. Maybe you only knew a few of them. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything you think I missed that was a really important fact about this album. Maybe there's something I said that you don't agree with. I'm happy to have friendly debates in the comments below. Always enjoy that, especially with like the last video I made for Please Please Me. We had a lot of great dialogue going on, and that's always great. Now, of course, there's always going to be the 1 or 2 people who decide to be kind of snarky and they want to be negative. That's okay. You can be negative if you want to. I really don't think it's all that great to be negative. And most of the time, if you're pretty negative, I'm not going to respond to you because I don't have time to deal with negativity like that. But I am definitely okay if you have a different opinion than me and you want to discuss it. I love that. I think that's great. And also, by the way, last time with the Please Please Me video, so many of you added amazing facts that either I got wrong or that I didn't mention at all. And I really appreciate that, because one thing I want to make clear is I am not a Beatles expert. I love the Beatles. I've studied the Beatles. I will continue to study the Beatles. But in no way am I a Beatles expert. And I am learning about them every single day. And I love when other people give me information that I didn't have before, or they correct me on something that I got wrong, or that I read a fact that was wrong that's been proven right, or whatever. I love that. So I'm super into that. So I hope no one is out there thinking like, why is this guy's got a big head. He thinks he's knows all about the Beatles. He's making all these videos. What gives him the right? I'm not that guy. I do have a big head though, but I'm not that guy. I love the Beatles, and I love talking about them, and I love making videos about them, and that's why I'm here. So that's it for With the Beatles. Stay tuned for the next Beatle video, top 10 Beatle video fact, and it will be the Beatles album A Hard Day's Night. So stay tuned for that. And by the way, while you're here, please visit my website, needlemeetsvinyl.com. It's a website where I am selling the best sounding records I can find. Lots of Beatle records, lots of records by all kinds of great artists like Bob Dylan, the Beach Boys, Fleetwood Mac, Neil Young, Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, Rolling Stones, etc., etc. What I do is I find, for example, like with the Beatles, I would find the best mono copies I can find. I get about, anywhere between 5 to 10 of them. I listen to all of them. I compare them against each other, and I find the best one in the best condition and list it on the website. So they are what are, in my opinion, the best sounding records you can get. So head on over to needlemeetsvinyl.com if that's something that would interest you, and check out the records I have on there. And stay tuned for the next top 10 Beatle facts for the Beatle albums coming up, Hard Day's Night. So stay tuned. Bye for now.